Hello. In our last two episodes, we looked at handloom weaving and the results of the handloom being mechanized, producing textiles, as we saw at Goodman Textiles. Now, existing similarly with the loom itself was another technique that was evolved for textiles, primarily by fishermen during, I suppose, the period 5000 BC. That's knitting. Knitting was initially a way of twining yarns or fibers together to make a container that was flexible to carry goods in. The Phoenicians, being a particularly coastal trading community about 4000 BC, developed the idea of making fish nets, and of course knitting evolved from that. Today we have, of course, all kinds of hand nets being made simply because it's become fashionable again. One tends to think of knitting as being a rather modern innovation. It isn't. It has quite a historic background. This is an example of a hand knit sweater, which is one that I'm currently working on. And you can see patterns in it. These patterns were evolved historically, oddly enough, to help identify drowned fishermen. This is called an Aran knit pattern, and it was evolved during the 15th, 16th centuries. And if you find historic examples of these in museums, you'll find these patterns all relate to specific locales, depending where the fishermen belong to. One tends to fear knitting these days simply because of knitting of pure wool anyway, simply because we're afraid of washing it because it shrinks badly. It only shrinks badly if one treats it badly. The construction of knitting is simply yarns that are looped together, so when it is washed they have a tendency to felt and tighten up in a very tight, hard fashion. But there's really no reason to worry about that, although mind you, most people who are knitting today tend to want to work with synthetic fibers. Synthetic fibers, as I mentioned at the Goodman Textile shop, doesn't breathe with the body, doesn't offer the same kind of warmth as does natural fibers, certainly not the way wool does. Therefore, it tends to feel clammy on the body, whereas wool worn next to the skin is heated by the heat from the body, and the cool air from the outside is being held close to the body and warmed, and therefore makes it comfortable. Many, many innovations happened during the centuries with knitting, and during the Middle Ages again, when we have the development of craft guilds, we had many types of knits being produced. And of course, in those days, they didn't knit things necessarily to the scale of the person's body. For instance, there were many thousands of men, women, and children who looked after sheep. You know, sheep herders usually looking after the sheep during the course of a day. We'd been knitting stockings, and they knitted them all one large size. That one large size was then placed into hot soapy water, placed around a form, and shrunk down to fit the leg. So you got a very hard-wearing, heavy type stocking. And I shall show you slides when it comes to our historic slide section in the next episode. But in the meantime, the development of knitting through the Middle Ages developed to a very, very high degree of expertise. There is an example, for instance, in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London of a map of Europe done in silk that was knitted on 21 needles. It was a masterpiece. The word masterpiece simply refers to an apprentice who has gone through the apprentice, journeyman, master stages in the craft guilds, and at the end of his apprenticeship is therefore required to produce one piece of a master work, signifying that they have indeed achieved a level of great expertise in that particular craft. The same applied to the textile weaving industry, the dyeing industry, the embroidering industry, all things to do with the specific crafts of making anything for that matter. So masterpieces, although incorrectly used today and tend to have a way of being very generally applied today, simply refer to a person's gaining of expertise during any given period. It's because we have such an important place for knit goods in our present society that really came about, I think, about 25 years ago, when today's society needed more flexible clothing, and you suddenly found things like crimplines and knitted trousers and men's knitted jackets being knit to look like they were hand-woven, but certainly done on a knitting machine, therefore giving more flexibility. The fashion was rather short-lived, unfortunately. It tends to seem to have gone off the fashionable trend these days. But most factories that were at that time producing woven goods on a standard loom or mechanized loom were obliged by society or by social needs to transfer their work from the loom onto knitting machines. And we have decided for our third episode to take you to the Nova Scotia Textile Limited Company in Windsor, Nova Scotia, which produces woven cotton and woven wool fabrics, which are then converted into underwear, into t-shirts, into jogging wear, and we'd like to show you all the processes as done by industry. Here we have a piece of fabric I brought back from the mill during our shooting of the processing, and it is simply a very fine knitted piece of textile with the inside brushed, and we will look at the various processes of this textile being assembled as it is presently done by industry. And we'll also show some goods made from this fabric. But it's interesting to note that the first machine for producing knitted textiles was created in the 16th century. A young man whose family had been knitters decided to put together a machine that would create a very small circular knit for making stockings. Stockings were an extremely important part of garment wearing at the time. He then took the machine to Elizabeth I of England and asked of her a patent to allow him to manufacture more machines to therefore produce more stockings. She was so overwhelmed by the idea of the machine and the possibility of putting out of work possibly 300,000 knitters throughout the northern part of England and Scotland that she said no, she wouldn't allow it to be produced. So he then sent it to Elizabeth I, and the ambassador from Spain sent back the machine very haughtily, including the silk stockings that were produced on the machine, stating that their queen had no legs and that they would have no reason to have a knitting machine in Spain. The fact is, of course, Spanish paintings of that period didn't show the Infanta's legs. It was considered to be unseemly. So it was sent then to Francis I of France, who of course delighted in the idea of having a knitting machine, and the first knitting machine was established at the small town of Tricoter, therefore the word tricoter, to knit today in the French language. But it begins the entire process of mechanizing this simple technique that had been done for centuries by hand, much the same way as weaving on the loom had been done by hand, that during the 19th century we have that entire range expanded from simple weaving of stocking material to finally cylindrical material that was cut at one side, flattened, and then made into various assortments of garment fabrics, finally into machines that were designed specifically for specific purposes, knitted laces, knitted shawls, knitted fabrics for body jackets, etc. So it became a very important means to produce textiles for the market. At the same time, of course, the industry itself was being rather heavily vulgarized because it was, again, producing so many variations on a theme that hand knitting as an art form died out, and it was just being revived due to the revival, as I mentioned earlier, to the arts and craft movement in 1860 by William Morris. That entire need to revive the ancient crafts of the Middle Ages brought about a revival of the hand knitting crafts, which began to coexist side by side, and with the development again of hand craftsmen producing wonderfully complicated hand knitted garments, provoked the machine to be extended and developed beyond its norm of just simply weaving a lock stitch machine or a knitted stretch machine. Now we have machines that are capable of doing the most extraordinary devices, including incorporating into knitting bead material, beaded fabrics, or small beads inserted into fabric to create a very handsome, elaborate beaded fabric. We have machine-made fishing nets now on the same kind of machine. We have machineries that will knit large areas of fabric very wide for the theater industry, for cycloramas or shark's-tooth gauzes that are used on stage for various transparency effects. So it's being used for a great many more things than simply clothing. And while we're at the knit mills, we'll look at the various processes of taking the raw cotton, again, a raw ball of cotton like this, and it will have added to it a percentage of polyester yarn, which will then give this cotton much more flexibility, much more ease of wearing, and will simplify its overall maintenance problems when it becomes a finished garment. We will then look at it passing from there into the carding machine, which is a mechanized version of the two brushes you saw in our second episode when I was brushing the wool on those two hand cards. We now see them in drum form, very coarse and very fine, combing the fibers very thinly in preparation for making the thread. We'll then go into the dye rooms to look at the finished yarn be dyed the color from the natural white cotton look into a whole myriad of colors. Then into the cutting room, where we'll see layers of this being placed on a table, cut through, and then to the sewing rooms to produce a finished product. Here we have in front of me a shirt, very much like the kinds of shirts that are being sold on the market today. This, of course, goes through several stages. It's a jogging shirt. And you can see the inside fabric above the neck edge has been brushed. And you'll find that this brushing is indeed one of the processes you will note in Windsor, Nova Scotia. And, of course, once the pieces are taken from the cutting table, you see all the seams through here. These sections are all put together independently and will then be assembled as a finished garment and bound around the edge, labeled with information that will tell you how to wash it and how to look after it, and then finally package it for sale. We're now in Windsor, Nova Scotia, and behind me is the Nova Scotia Textiles Limited Company. The building itself built in 1881 as a knitting company, and now still producing and manufacturing cotton goods for underwear, outerwear, and the current jogging wear. Today we're going to look at the processing of raw stock, a mixture of cotton and polyester, into the final manufacturing of this finished t-shirt. What you see coming out of the bin above this hopping machine is in actual fact a blend of cotton and polyester. That blend will differ depending on its ultimate use, whether 60% cotton, 30% polyester, 40% polyester, whatever the combination is. It's pre-mixed, then placed into the hopper of this feeding machine that will take this raw cotton polyester blend. There's a tangled mass in my hand, and what its function is to comb the fibers until each of those fibers are very fine, parallel structure, and creating one long, very thin sheet that will then ultimately be cut into very fine slivers and then turned into roving and made into spun into fine yarn. So this feeder is now pushing the yarn forward at a programmed rate. It goes then into the brushes of the card machine. First coarse brushes, medium brushes, finer brushes. Each brush is turning at a very high speed, combing the fiber until it's getting a nice fine sheet of parallel fiber yarns. At the last beam here, you'll find the sheet of very soft cotton polyester being combed off, fed into the conveyor belt, and taken up, carried across, and laying horizontally on another card. This card is the same machine, repeating the process of the first, but with finer teeth, and therefore probably set a little closer together and give more of a finer end product. Once more, the yarn is fed through very slowly, all at program rates, through these fine cards, spinning in opposite directions, so they're combing again, constantly combing, straight through. Another set of cards. It goes through quite an active process. And at the final beam, and we see the final sheet of combed cotton polyester being taken off by this knife that's agitating up and down very rapidly and is cutting off, or peeling off, I should say, this very fine sheet of cotton polyester. It is then picked up by these green elastic bands, and they're made into what is known as slivers. You can see the sliver now clinging to the green band as it goes from the sheet on the band and is carried through these rubbing mats, and they are doing this to the sliver, which then ultimately makes the first roving prior to spinning. We're now at the back end of the machine, where the sliver has moved between the rubbing segments and is rubbing back and forth, creating the roving, which is then wound onto this back beam and is taken off and is then carried into the spinning frames to be spun into yarn. Roving, in actual fact, looks like this, very soft, pulled apart quite easily, but at high speed it is then twisted and turned until it becomes the yarn for the sweaters, t-shirts, jogging suits, underwear, whatever. That is step one in the making of a t-shirt. Here we see the bobbin, the actual beam with the roving on it, being wound and fed into these rollers and being fed through this chamber, down and through a very fine loop at the base, which is feeding very rapidly around the bobbin. The bobbin is moving down and will move back up again and will eventually fill itself and will come off the loom like this, off the spinning frame, I should say. So we have the yarn wound onto a bobbin that will then go from this to the winding frame and be wound onto what is known as cheeses to simplify the weaving process. Here we have a bobbin with the yarn on it, and it's about to be wound onto this cone here. It is in fact wound around a cardboard core and then produces this cone of cotton yarn. Sometimes in producing very fine yarns to minimize breakage in the weaving process, it's given a fine sizing. In this case, this machine will rewind from this to another cone, passing through a silicone disc, imparting to the yarn a very fine layer of wax to prevent the yarn from breaking when it goes through the knitting process. Here we see the yarn now placed in the cone and being fed through various guides around the guides to this hook disc, which finally hooks the yarns around these hooks that are placed here, and that, while the machine is revolving, is then producing the knit fabric. Fabrics are created on the knitting machines in circular fashion. As you can see, now the hooks are being fed and released, and the yarn building up the finished fabric onto the beam at the top of the loom. Unlike normal weaving looms, hand looms, there's a beam at the back and beam in the front, and the shuttle going back and forth creating a weft. This is now being woven around in circular fashion, creating by body size the size of tube required, small, medium, and large, and that facilitates the ease with which garments are cut and minimizes waste. There are many different kinds of machines in the market at the moment. This is a merino machine, very much like the machine that t-shirts are made from. The one behind me is the kind of machine that will be used for jogging suits, because the outside fabric that's being woven now will be brushed into a fine nap. Behind me there are many, many other machines, all weaving different kinds of fabric, different key structures for different purposes. You can see them moving behind me now. All fabric taken from knitting machines or the loom is known to be in its gray state. This does not refer to as color, but simply means the fabric taken directly off the loom or the knitting machine with the tension, spinning oils, dust from the air settled inside. It then must go to the scouring tubs and the cleaning tubs to be cleaned and then dyed. Across here we have a large dye vat, similar to the cleaning of fabric vats. This has about 800 yards of fabric being rotated in its final dye coloring, now being rinsed to get rid of the dye residue. The fabric in here would make about 75 dozen garments, shirts, drawers, what have you. And when it passes from this, it's then rolled onto bolts that are then taken to the drying ovens. The drying ovens are in fact a series of hot chambers that allows the fabric to go in and out, up and down, until finally air drying the fabric and it comes out dry at one end. It is then rolled in bolts, and we see it finished here. This is now the fabric from that dye vat has been turned into this cream fabric for the Department of National Defense. Once the fabric comes from the dyeing and the drying room, it arrives here wrapped in a bolt and then placed onto the napping machine. The napping machine then has the fabric fed around a cylinder with steel brush teeth on the cylinder, and that brushes both sides of the inside of the actual fabric. In this case, the inside of the fabric is on the outside and is therefore being brushed both sides simultaneously. And this gives you the familiar lining that we find on the inside of jogging suits, sweatshirts, sweatpants, heavy winter underwear, that sort of nice, cottony, woolly feeling. As the fabric is progressed through this machine, it then arrives in a bin at the end, and it goes to its final stage, and that is to bring it back out to its original woven width, steamed in that position, and is then ready to be cut into clothing. Now we see the fabric processed that we saw being knitted downstairs, washed, finished, ready for cutting, layered one on top of the other in multi-layers on the cutting table. They'll all be cut at once. The pattern is then be marked on in pencil, guide marks notched, placed in position, ready for the cutter to cut in multiple layers. And here he's about to do that. You'll see this knife cutting through many, many layers of fabric all at once, thereby speeding up the process. several cuts down the inside seam of the leg. And we're now going to notch the separate pieces, again where he previously marked them, by a curious machine that has a heat wire or a hot wire that will melt the fabric and create the notches. And that allows the operators to see exactly where the pieces are to be placed when it comes to sewing them. You can see how the wire is now burning a notch into the fabric. And now the pieces are ready to be assembled into numbered sections like this and sent upstairs to be assembled into the finished garment. In this case, drawers for underwear or the t-shirt we will see upstairs. From the cutting room downstairs, we now come up to the sewing room. This part of the sewing room specifically does t-shirts. I have beside me bits of t-shirts, fronts, backs, collars, yokes, bindings, and they are indeed placed piece by piece together by skilled machinists working at machines that will put t-shirt sections together, and in this run of machinists will create one t-shirt. This young lady beside me is placing twill tape on a shoulder seam with a serge or lock stitch machine, and that locks and prevents stretch on the t-shirt itself. This machinist is now placing the sleeves in position. They are positioned and finished around the arm again to prevent stretch. Sleeves are being inserted by this machinist again, and the green binding attached around the neck edge. This machinist is now placing a hem on the bottom of the t-shirt, like so. And in the final stages we have a finished t-shirt. Seams being sewn together, arms placed in, binding on the edge of the arms, neck binding, final hemming, ready for pressing and wearing. Or if you prefer, to have them screen printed. Anything you wish. This is our choice. There, quite a fascinating trip, wasn't it? Mind you, the Nova Scotia Textile Limited Company was very generous in allowing us to wander through at our leisure and photograph the processes you've just seen in a very small way. If you consider the size of the world population today and the extraordinary size of the machine companies throughout Switzerland, China, France, Germany, America, Canada, all producing similar fabrics, it's not surprising that it really occupies the time of a great many craftspeople, a great many workers. In future episodes, in fact the next episode, we're going to look at some historic slides to show some of the ancient machines I have mentioned and look at the development of the machines and various costumes produced during historic periods to look at how fabrics were being assembled and costume fabrics were being treated for everyday wear for the societies as it developed throughout history. We have today in modern manufacturing processes, the designer who produces a sample fabric, a sample garment in fabrics, usually a very simple cotton or what they call mull, a rather inexpensive fabric, on a dress form. It is then taken into the mill and costed. Each seam in the garment is being evaluated as to how long it takes to put together, how long the entire garment takes to put together, so that one can evaluate the total cost of fabric, the labor involved in production, the packaging, the dyeing processing, the advertising, to see exactly what that single garment will indeed cost. Nowadays, with the invention of the laser machine, we no longer have men or women cutting with those wonderful sharp knives. We have a bed that goes across the entire length of the fabric, multi-layers again, with a very fine beam of laser which cuts through the fabric by burning straight through the seams and makes the thing a lot more rapid. We have also the problem of grading patterns, because today the body comes in so many different sizes that when it comes to making garments for the market, we have to remember that there are small, medium, large, fat, thin, bent, crooked, whatever body shape we are, clothing is being manufactured for us. This process is known as grading. You take a simple pattern and you expand it to cope with the different sizes in the marketplace itself. And of course, the machines that used to be used for this process are now mechanized as well. We now have the same kind of computerized machines, very much like the laser machine that cuts the fabric. In actual fact, prints a pattern out, small, medium, and large, size 12, size 8, size 14, whatever the size that happens to be. And the entire process, of course, is so mechanized that sometimes looking at the mill in Windsor, we're rather overwhelmed going into the large ones. It's too bad that we hadn't access to a very large industrial factory to watch that processing, because the amount of energy involved in producing the clothing for us today is enormous. I think oftentimes because we tend to be able to walk into shops and buy garments so easily, we tend not to think really about their origin, nor are we too concerned about the extraordinary wealth involved in the production of textiles. And I think this rather cavalier attitude to textiles and cavalier attitude to clothing makes us a little careless when it comes to buying or selling. We tend to walk into shops and buy clothing simply for the whim of an evening's wear, or the whim of anything that's dictated by fashion. And once that whim has lasted its length, or the novelty is worn off, we scrap the garment, or we just pass it on to some other use. It ends up in second-hand shops or in other sources. But in actual fact, the amount of money that is generated by the textile industry is in the mega millions. It's almost too large a quantity even to contemplate. Many households in history have been made and broken by the interchange of textiles. And I think it's very important for us just to sit quietly and think about the value of it to us, and begin to maybe the next time walk into a shop to purchase a piece of clothing, we'll then be more careful at looking at the quality of the garment, the way it's finished off inside, whether indeed it needs to be dry cleaned, whether it has to be or can be washed in a machine, what kind of special care it requires, and I think maybe look a little more carefully at the dollars we spend on clothing and buy more judiciously. I think it's rather important for all of us, especially in these times of financial restraints, to be a little more cautious in purchasing. I know that I design many garments for contemporary uses today, and the first discussion the clients and I have is about the fabric and the wear and the possible problems it will encounter when she's wearing it. And so we talk to these items very carefully before actually producing. So until next week and the historic slides, thank you very much.